Greetings. Welcome to Kadika, the Peer Review Science channel. So today we're going to be discussing considerations for historians reading genetic. Oh, sorry about that. So I'm going to repeat that. We're going to be getting into considerations for historians reading genetic studies. So as I got into college, um, as a historian, at this point, which my concentrations are interdisciplinary, meaning that I have experience in or training in advanced linguistics. Uh, I have high level proficiency in transliterations and translations of Egyptological primary sources. I have training in African history, comparative civilizations, even cultural anthropology, physics, a lot of different interdisciplinary studies that's related to my field. And what I have been learning in college is that genetic studies are not apodictic, right? It's not apodictic, as some may will present it on, probably YouTube or Facebook. So this is a world-renowned historian in peer-reviewed data. What you're looking at is peer review data. Of course, this is a peer review channel, and we only show peer review data, right? And rest in peace to Christopher Ehret. Man, this man put in a lot of work, though I do not. With my advanced linguistic training, even before I was in advanced linguistics, remember I had 80 hours of linguistic training in historical linguistics. So thus far, I do not agree with his linguistic analysis. I think that his linguistic analysis does not adhere to the methodological approaches of historical linguistics, and it deters from that. But he gave good historical work. He tried to use linguistics, what he may the limits of what he know about linguistics. He doesn't have a degree in linguistics, and I'm not sure even if he was trained in advanced linguistics because his methodological approaches and his linguistic analysis is just too flawed. And I even have peer reviews and reviews from historical linguists who disagree also with his work, right? So, and they are peer reviewed data as well. But nonetheless, Christopher Ehret is an excellent historian. His focus and concentrations are interdisciplinary. He uses approaches from anthropology. He uses some approaches from genetics. He is a distinguished research fellow, so he is very high level. He obtained a Bachelor of Science in history, and then he obtained a Ph.D. also in history as well. So he wrote this text right here, and this is a chapter just to summarize how we uh um get in before we get into, all right. So I think that's a good summary of this excellent scholar. Rest in peace to Christopher Ehret and his work in African history. Okay, so as I had been saying for many years, even before I was in started to uh make my journey to become a PhD. And I had, I'm going through all the levels, and soon I will be a PhD very soon. But now entering, almost finished with the Bachelor of Science in History, and will be into the Master of Arts program. I haven't thought about what I'm gonna take. I know I love history and I love interdisciplinary studies. So it's either going to be between those two, interdisciplinary as in history and linguistics, or um, per history, but at the same time, just like Christopher Ehret, I have advanced linguistic trainings. Thus far, I can publish in various types of journals because my interdisciplinary uh, college electives that I already have taken and passed. Also, my GPA is up to par where I can get into mainly a lot of high level research colleges that I'm looking into. So even before and after my academic training, I already knew that genetics is not apodictic. All right, it's not. I know y'all may think that it is, but it is far from apodictic. And also in my African history elective in college, they warned historians about that. And also in my advanced linguistics that I took in college, they also warned that genetics is not linguistics, right? Historical methodological approaches and historical methodology is not genetics. These are very different fields from each other. Not only are they different, but in the sense of genetics, which is the focus here, it is not apodictic in no possible manner. A lot of guys, they are recovering from the pseudo age, right? Which all of us was affected by due to incompetent academics, incompetent leaders, black leaders in our community, which gave us a lot of inaccurate information, unfortunately. But as I am learning and getting, as an honor student, and I'm learning about the methods and approaches and the nuances to this, we have to understand where this peer reviewed data is talking about here. So it says considerations for historians, being that I'm about to get my Bachelor of Science in History. I think this will be good for the Kadika audience who are into higher level learning or higher education materials, secondary sources, etc. So it says considerations for historians reading genetic studies. That's important. Mind you, I learned this in African history elective, and I also learned this in advanced linguistic elective as well. So this is no different for me or historians. So I just want to make this a central point where when we are looking at these genetic studies, you must keep in mind these studies are not apodictic. No matter what people may try to religiousify it or they try to make it into some type of quasi religion, it's not. I'm sorry. So this excellent historian. So this excellent historian uh, explains it well. So it says from this is peer reviewed data from Princeton University Press, which is a peer reviewed book publisher. We do not share anything unless it's peer reviewed data. Hence the name of our channel. So let's get to it. uh, Christopher Ehret says, despite the general view among biologists these days that the concept of race does not apply in explaining human variation, historians need to be aware that racialist thinking can still linger unacknowledged even in the work of geneticists. So as even Sui Kiyata has a peer reviewed data where he explains the biasness in genetic studies. Now, this historian, Christopher Ehret, is explaining that there are still racial problems in the genetic studies itself. This is what the peer reviewed data said. It's not my opinion. So let's continue. It says the assertion in a recent such article, for example, that there is no sub-Saharan component in the Egyptian population betrays an unexamined assumption that traces back to racist early 20th century scholarship that there was something like a true Negro type. that this pure type was represented by certain coastal West African populations. Now, mind you, you see that today on YouTube. You hear people say, "Oh, sub-Saharan African," and then they equate it automatically with being West African, right? When south of the Sahara, as far as my Bachelor of Science program, when we are looking into the south of the Sahara, also called sub-Saharan Africa, West Africa is not the only component or element of what makes a sub-Saharan African, if that's even scientifically possible, right? Now, let's continue. This historian says that this pure type was represented by certain coastal West African populations. The adjective sub-Saharan is itself the particular historically loaded term used repeatedly in earlier literature to convey that kind of racialist belief and attitude, and thus a terminology very much to be avoided. All right. So, sub-Saharan African or being sub-Saharan should be avoided, even though to date, geneticists still use the term. They are not stopping in using this term. Okay. Now, let's continue. But the Horn of Africa, of course, is also entirely south of the Sahara. So that will be considered sub-Saharan Africa. Now it says, and as noted in chapter 5, scholars have already identified a genetic marker of a significant population component moving north from that region, spreading not just into Egypt, but beyond there to the Levant, where early Semitic was spoken, and across North Africa and the Sahara among Amazigh speakers. So this sub-Saharan component and element gradates all the way from the southern portion northwards, even into the northeast. Now it says, so the assertion that there is no sub-Saharan genetic component in Egypt is nonsense. Even though he said, sub-Saharan itself should be avoided, again, a lot of scholars, when they say sub-Saharan should be avoided, they still use it. Even though he said it should be avoided, again, he still uses the term. Right here, he still uses it. See? So he said, so the assertion that there is no sub-Saharan genetic component in Egypt is nonsense. And I've been saying that is nonsensical for so long. People only point out either a later kingdom relation to northeast, the north, Near East. They only point to later cultural diffusion or genetic diffusion all the way up in the Mediterranean area. They never talk about the components that are of sub-Saharan origin, so-called sub-Saharan origin. You notice that? And this scholar is saying that we have to be careful with these genetic studies. Let's continue though. It says a related problem for historians to be aware of when reading the works of geneticists is that geneticists, when trying to correlate genetics with history. Now, mind you, I already touched on that in college. I was trained that genetics is not linguistics. Genetics even is not history itself. These are two different fields. It shouldn't even be correlated, but a lot of scholars are interdisciplinary to date and are advancing the studies, even though it kind of shouldn't even be together. But let's continue. It says, let's read it again. A related problem for historians to be aware of when reading the works of geneticists is that geneticists, when trying to correlate genetics with history, too often have relied on secondary rather than primary sources. Okay. Anyone who have a Bachelor of Science or in the program that I am in, which is a Bachelor of Science in History, you will adhere to the historian's craft. The historian's craft is historical methodology. What is the historical methodological approaches, which is a qualifying, right, approach, meaning that we spend a great deal of our time, efforts, and focus and concentrations on various types of sources. The types of sources that we deal with can vary, in its not really a long list, but it's quite a few sources that we view as quantifying our data. And I will focus on the two main sources. One source is what we call primary materials. Okay, primary materials is very important to a historian. Uh, Primary materials is, for example, when people say, "Oh, the Egyptians are not black," being that I have proficiency in ancient Egyptian language, writing, history, chronology in itself, translations, transliterations, I can look at the primaries myself and translate and transliterate those primaries. I have seen numerous Egyptians call themselves black, right? Even to a point where I recently submitted my paper to a peer reviewed journal, to an Egyptological journal, and probably also after that, if that's not good enough, probably I will have to submit it to a archaeological African journal as well. But it's still under review. So what I have done is I looked at its history, and not secondary, because I don't, as a historian, we are trained not to rely on secondary interpretation, even though secondary sources are excellent. But it's always good to read and see if we can find primary evidence. Primaries are, likely the strongest evidence we can find, because that's what Egyptians viewed themselves, right? Set themselves. So the primary materials has a adjective modifier operation. Adjective modifier operations is when the descriptor, which is the adjective, follows and modifies the noun. Once it does that, it turns the subject black, right? Or anything dark, etc. Now, mind you, black to Egyptians varies. It can vary from brown, because cows are also called kim, which they are brownish in color. Some kim attributed to different shades of darkness, brown, from brown to reddish brown, etc. Even peer review data backs us here. Now, from just primary materials, we find numerous Egyptians describing their skin complexion as black or dark, right? Or what we would say brownish, darkest color. Now, the question was, in my scholarship or my missive, was that, okay, if Egyptians called themselves black, did they call other Africans black? Because if they did, case will be closed according to primary materials. So what I did was found not only did they call Nubians black or Kim, they also called other types of Africans in Ethiopia black and Kim as well. So I put a missive together and do what a scholar's supposed to do, and submitted my argument not on YouTube, not on Facebook, but to a scientific Egyptological peer-reviewed journal. All right, which is awaiting, which is under review at this point. I submitted another paper, which is also under review, and I'm getting ready to submit my linguistic paper, where I reconstructed proto Negro Egyptian from being that Afro-Asiatic, according to timely peer review data, is not scientifically established. And peer review data states that being that is not scientifically established, we should stop using it. Also, Afro-Asiatic doesn't exist scientifically. So if that's the case, then we should start comparing ancient Egyptian with more so-called sub-Saharan languages, which is my argument. So I will be submitting that, and that was preliminarily accepted. All right. So that was preliminarily accepted already. So the only thing I have to do is look at all of the refinements, and I'm almost finished the refinements, and then I will be submitting that. So I have 3 peer-reviewed papers submitted all. One of the papers, as I just explained, deals with primary materials of ancient Egyptians, not only describing themselves as black, but they're describing Nubians and Ethiopians as black. And when I say Nubians and Ethiopians, meaning that from different time periods, you have a case where the primary materials say that a Nubian is Kim. Then you have another saying that an Ethiopian is Kim. You see? So these are things where geneticists will avoid, and also certain historians, being that they doesn't have proficiency like I have in the primary materials, they rely strictly on secondary interpretation, which limits their scope of research. But let's continue here. It says, when trying to correlate genetics with history, too often have relied on secondary rather than primary sources. And not just secondary sources, but often outdated. Now, remember, as historians, we rely on what? The historian's craft. What is the historian's craft? Historical methodology. See? So, in my college, you will fail if you submit, say you have to do a paper this week. You have a paper that's due this week. Say it is a, let's give or take, the paper is dealing with ancient Roman history. All right. You have to submit a paper. You have sections of the Turabian format, which is primary materials, and you separate those sections in Turabian format from primary to secondary bibliography. So you have a 2-winged bibliography, which one deals with your primary evidence, and your other bibliographical format of citations deals with your secondary. Now, if you submit that paper in a higher learning facility or institution that's accredited, and you are citing secondary sources that are outdated, I mean, you're citing, past 25 years. You're citing things all the way in Petrie's time, not saying that Petrie's data all of his data is inaccurate, but it's wholly outdated. And you're strictly relying on that type of secondary source material. This is what this great historian is mentioning here. As a historian, we do not cite very old data from 1993, 1995, or something like that. It has to be at least within the last 25 years to be considered what we call timely. So this historian is a real researcher, and I'm explaining some of his historian craft to you as he explaining it here. So it says, I'll read it again. When trying to correlate genetics with history, too often have relied on secondary rather than primary sources. And not just secondary sources, but often outdated, occasionally even long outdated publications, leading them to propose insupportable correlations between genetics and other findings. This kind of mistake remains only too common, and so historians need always to be critically aware of this possibility when consulting works from the human genetics field. So this is a warning for historians, and I was like, let me show this great historian's work and show that genetics is simply not predicted. Now, he gives example of, but the problem of relying on outdated sources is small potatoes compared with the truly outlandish claims made in a recent article of the usefulness of genetics, improving and disproving language relationships in several of the world's language families. So they are starting to use, geneticists are trying to use genetics to explain language relationships in articles. This historian quote that, though I wholly disagree with this guy's Christopher Ehret's Afroasiatic, as we already know, I already did a video of peer reviewed data saying that Afroasiatic itself is completely unscientific. It's not scientific. It's not established scientifically. It doesn't adhere to historical linguistic methodology at all, and it should be avoided. And also, there are questions: does it even actually exist? I already showed that here. Y'all can look through the videos I have done, the past videos, to find that particular lecture. All right. So, but just focusing on this issue of genetics and why genetics is just not apodictic, and these are some reasons, and why we as historians, ain't for everyone, but why we academic historians, those who are in college, who are making a career, trying to get a career. I will be making a career of all my hard work in my journey, in my academic journey of being a adjunct professor, probably in the near future. And we must pay attention to these nuances that can make your work very biased. All right. And we don't want our work to be biased. So I want y'all to have a good day. I'll leave some questions if anyone have questions. Oh, peace. Brother Jeremiah, powerful. This brother has a general studies associates and law. He's in the bachelor's program in law, and I'm pretty sure he can vouch that it's dangerous to begin to mix sciences. If we are not respecting the methodological approaches to each field. It's dangerous if we are making apodictic statements. So this excellent historian gave us a warning. Historians a warning when we are viewing genetic studies. I want y'all to enjoy your day. Any questions? I'll give y'all like 2 minutes or so. Nope. So everything is transparent here, and I'll read it again. The assertion in a recent such article, for example, that there is no sub-Saharan component in Egyptian population betrays an unexamined assumption that traces back to racist early 20th century scholarship, right? That there was something like a true Negro type, and that this per type was represented by certain coastal West African populations. They do that now. Oh no, it's no. Egyptians are not black because we are West African. Like what? That is so non-scientific. Or there's no sub-Saharan African components, and they even misconstrue this and think that just because we say African, sub-Saharan African affinities. See, as a linguist, I know what the term affinity means. Affinity is not saying something is exactly like something. It's saying it shares affinities with something. See what I mean? And they come with all types of delusional arguments and logical fallacies, and then they begin to do ad hominems and things of that nature, which is dangerous, right? And when we are conducting research. So enjoy your day.